So the latest update brought us Ultimate Sharen, a character long overlooked in favor of others like Bunny or recently Freyna, and to be completely honest, that is not going to change. People are still going to like those characters. But depending on what you're after or your playstyle, Sharen does absolutely take a massive shit on every other character because she not only gets to do millions of damage per skill cast in dungeons, she also gets to subvert any and all risk to herself while doing so. And we're going to talk about how. And on that note, right off the bat I want to say this, anyone telling you to use area suppression instead of ambushed on a mobbing build is on crack. Before we go over the mods that we're using, I need to very quickly explain the basis for Sharen's invisibility and bonuses. Sharen's second ability lets you go invisible, and then whenever you take an action, be it shooting your weapon or casting a skill, you lose the invisibility, but you gain bonuses. As of Season 2, while you are in the invisibility, you now gain a bonus to move speed, and when exiting invisibility, the action that caused you to exit not only gets the damage bonus that it had before, but it now gets also a bonus to the base crit rate, be it the weapon or your skill. The crit stuff is pretty cool, but what has always been cool is the damage bonus, because it straight up takes your end total damage. This is a multiplier separate from base skill power ratio or attack percent bonuses. It's not anything that you normally get in your mods. It's a distinct multiplier that takes your damage and just doubles it, or triples it if you're using Overcharged Edge. And on top of that, Haley's passive makes it so if you are attacking an enemy that isn't targeting you, you get an additional 15% that adds together with it. Now keep in mind those are not separate things. So it's not a doubled multiplier and then a 15% multiplier. They add together to be one thing, so it'd be times 2.15 instead. Both of these bonuses have always been cool, and her invisibility has been nice for outposts, but outside of outposts, they've never really had any practical, meaningful use case besides getting big PP numbers only on the first shot in a fight with a Colossus. Now, however, we have the new Transcendent mod for her called Ambushed, and this makes it so if she ever kills something with a gun or with a skill, then even though you'd normally exit invisibility when dealing that kind of damage, now you don't, and instead you get your invisibility back, the invisibility's timer is refreshed, and you get your doubled damage bonus ready to use again. On top of that, Ambush also modifies the Shock Nut skill, which normally just stuns enemies in an area, and it removes the stun, but it gives you a pretty big damage modifier that deals its damage in an AoE, giving you now an AoE mob clear skill instead of the tiny ass range of her short sword. For those who haven't fully put together why this is so fucking cracked in dungeons, let's put this in perspective. Because of Ambush, you now have an AoE mob clear ability that gets a permanent 2x damage bonus every time you cast it, because you're going to be stealthed whenever you are, while also permanently granting you a 22% bonus base crit rate, since you're also, again, always going to be stealthed, while also just in general letting you always be stealthed. And I need to really drive home how much damage Shock Nuts, or Frangible Rounds is the new name when Ambushed is on, will be doing, because it's not a little. You're doing 2 to 3+ million damage, even against elites, which means the condition of achieving 1 kill per skill cast is not a concern. You have enough damage to not only kill your target, but also blow a hole into the dungeon. And you have 0 personal risk while doing it. If any of you have seen Hunter x Hunter, it really reminds me of when the iguana guy was telling Gon about how his invisibility works, because it's not just being hidden, it was the ability to not be realized and do anything you wanted without anyone knowing you existed. Because enemies in this game have 0 methods to deal with invisibility. They have no method to detect you, so you can just keep nuking them off the planet while they sit there and watching their friends get murdered like Skyrim guards thinking it must have been the wind. And because of that, there's a large difference here between what Sharen can achieve and what Bunny or Freyna can achieve in dungeons right now. Freyna and Bunny can clear dungeons easily because they most often kill enemies before the enemies could realistically retaliate. They have no time to, else the enemies would probably kill them and the builds would not work the same. Sharen, on the other hand, is virtually future-proof because it doesn't matter how hard they make the dungeons going forward. She's gonna fuck them all and have the damage to handle the mobs that get made harder while still being perfectly safe. And then 2 quick notes. The first is that what counts as a kill for Ambush's refresh condition is super broad. You don't actually need to kill like an enemy as you would think it is. You just need to kill something that is considered a hostile entity, which includes but is not limited to physical projectiles shot at you. So if you have a homing projectile that's following you, if you kill that, that counts as a kill. Extensions of the target itself or summons, so if you're in a dungeon and the enemy spawns little objects around the room, killing those counts as a kill. There's going to be a lot of times where you use the skill and it refreshes and you're going to be very confused on what it killed to do so. And really it's just because a lot more counts as a kill than you would think. Lastly, Ambushed also makes it so while invisible, you gain a 30% cooldown reduction, and that, paired with the base crit bonuses, play heavily into the build I'm going to discuss here. So now let's talk about the mods. For general survivability, we are taking increased HP, and that's it. That's all we actually need, because for the most part, we are going to be permanently invisible. Now, why bother with HP at all? It's because we're not invincible, we are just invisible and undetectable. Meaning that if you're playing with others, and they get shot, but you're in between them and the enemy, you're still gonna get hit. So it's good to have a tiny little cushion of HP to deal with that when needed. Regarding skill damage on crits, we will take skill concentration, front lines, and emergency measures. But we will not take skill insight, because that would be a colossal fucking waste. Sharen has 20% base crit rate, which is the highest in the game next to Blair, I believe. And then Ambushed gives us an additional 22% base, meaning Sharen's true base crit rate, while invisible, is 42%. Front lines and the emergency measures put us at a 92.3% bonus multiplicative against our base crit rate. So 42% times 1.923 means we already have a crit rate of 80.76 without skill insight. Adding skill insight is an option, but it's a stupid one, because now we have Blue Beetle, which got buffed to change its bonus from a 30% bonus crit rate all the way up to 115%. So instead of the 42 times 1.923 that we gave before, instead it will be 42 times 3.073, putting our total potential crit rate all the way up to 129%, but we obviously cap out at 100. Again, someone might be concerned that these bonuses couldn't be relied upon and they're only applicable on a kill while we're invisible, but I swear to God, guys, look at this fucking damage number from a 400% dungeon and tell me that's a legitimate concern, because it's not. You are always going to be getting kills. And even if you somehow fail, you've got a tiny ass cooldown, because we've got Nimble Fingers, an MP conversion, and paired with a 30% bonus while we're invisible, we are at the 90% cap of cooldown reduction, making almost all of our regens nearly instantaneous. We take skill expansion for more range, and since Frangible Rounds has a 200% range cap, range expansion puts us right to it. Anything more would be wasted. For power ratios, we take Electric Specialist and then Dangerous Ambush. An ambush might raise a few eyebrows here, because in a mobbing build, you normally never take this thing. It's generally pointless. You are pretty much always going to be targeted by the enemy. Obviously, Sharen doesn't have that concern. On top of Dangerous Ambush, though, we also take the Slayer set for more base skill power ratio. And that's actually it. The last mod is Flex. I personally chose to take Fusion Specialist because that is the highest damage increase available. But given that we are already doing millions of fucking damage, it's really not a huge deal. You can bring cost mods if you want, and that's perfectly fine. I, in my experience, never had an issue with cost, even with the Slayer set cost penalty. And the primary reason for that, and why I personally believe that cost is not required in your mods, is because you are never taking any damage, which means that the MP regen in combat will always be in effect. If you're confused on why that is, go watch my Lepic video as I talk about MP management and combat states and the different types of regen in there. But for Sharen, that means that as long as she hasn't taken any damage in the last 5 seconds, she can deal damage and still benefit from in-combat regen bonuses. So while the cost penalty from Slayer is normally pretty hefty on skill spam characters, we don't actually give a shit here because we're getting MP back all the fucking time. On the note of components, as I mentioned before though, obviously yeah, you still want the Slayer set here. As on almost every other skill-based character, the damage bonus is just way too big to pass up on, and the cost penalty is moot for the reasons we already discussed. The sensor having MP regen in combat is probably the most important role to get, and then if you can, get a max MP roll on there, and you are set for life. For your weapon, you want to be running the Blue Beetle Scout Rifle as mentioned earlier. I didn't particularly elaborate on why, but the benefit of the unique ability is triggered every time a character with a fusion skill casts a fusion skill. And since with Ambushed on, that is your 1, 3, and 4 that are all fusion, that means that everything you do is always going to be triggering this crit rate bonus of 115%. It is literally just crit rate the weapon. For your Reactor on mobbing, you would want a fusion roll paired with a crit damage roll, and for bossing, you would want a Colossus roll with either of the two mentioned before. Speaking of bossing though, that's actually what area suppression is good for. Slap that on the exact same build as before. You can swap out range for skill insight if you want, because now we're not getting as much crit rate, and then go hump a boss's legs and spam cast your 4, and that's gonna do some really good damage, but at best, it is a gimmick build. It will pass the Kill Devourer in one phase test, but so does literally everything in this game. It's not impressive, and I've seen people that tried to showcase it on other bosses like Swamp Walker killing it in one phase. And sure, you can manage it, but it's kind of like the pre-buff SMO days, where it's possible, but it is not reliable, and anyone telling you otherwise is lying through their teeth. Don't misunderstand though, area suppression gives Sharen a good bossing option if you have no other skill-based characters built for solo Colossus fights, but it is not amazing and you are better suited building into other available characters. And the reason why I praise Ambushed as much as I do in this video compared to Area Suppression, despite there also being better dungeon characters available, is the same reasons I mentioned earlier. Ambushed gives Sharen a future-proofed dungeon build that will always be good, whereas Bunny and the others very much have a damage ceiling, where if content scales much farther beyond it, they're fucked. Sharen doesn't have that issue. Sharen also has other Transcendent mod options, but they've been around since the game launched, and people have already discussed them 200 times over by now, so I am not interested in rehashing them. This video was meant to address what is offered to Sharen now that is new, but again, if you care about the math behind how all of those modules work, I'll have that all added to my site later so you can build around it if you'd like. The only thing worth mentioning from before that I'll slip in here is don't sleep on Battlesuit melting rounds. The 40% defense decrease to enemies can be a huge boon to team weapon damage in more difficult fights like Gluttony, and Sharen with Battlesuit melting is extremely well suited to the position of someone who drops a debuff and then grapples onto the shoulder while everyone else deals damage. In closing, Sharen is a very shitty boss killer. She's a great team support, and now she's an S tier dungeon runner with the new mods. And then yes, I guess she can also be used for outposts as well, but no one really gives a shit about that. Also, if you are the kind of person who stumbles upon a Sharen doing an outpost out in the wild, and you don't let them finish it in stealth, your mother never loved you.